Why is it important to normalize mental health conversations? How to make choices in the broad and complex spectrum that is mental health. All this and much more you will get in this episode. I am Regina Larco, founder, host, and producer of #Impact, a podcast about stuff that matters. And I'm so grateful that you are spending time with us here. We don't take you for granted. And if you're curious to hear a little bit about how this podcast started, you can take a listen at #impact.com/ourstory. Today, it is my absolute privilege and honor to welcome Juhi Gangaramani as the host of this episode of #Impact. As Juhi speaks with Adelaide Ng, a former leader of youth-run organization Peace of Mind, this conversation gives you a rare and unheard perspective that may change the way you see mental health stigma and how students are really struggling in this new world. Please let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and you can always reach out to us at hello@impact.com or connect with us on Instagram at #impact. I'll put all the links in the show notes so you can find it easily. And now, let me hand over that mic to Juhi.
Hi, #Impact listeners. Today, I am joined by someone that really inspires me and who really has a passion for mental health and psychology and also theater. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce her. Her name is Adelaide, and she is a Hong Kong-based student who has previously taken on the role as the head of Peace of Mind, which is a youth-powered nonprofit that encourages conversations to educate and break the stigma surrounding mental health. The organization has made incredible strides in leading an outreach program, providing vital resources, and promoting positive messages and advice on social media for both students at her school and to Hong Kong youth. In this episode, we discuss Adelaide's experience as a part of the organization, as well as her insight into perspectives on mental health stigma as a teenager in Hong Kong and during the pandemic. I'd like to welcome Adelaide. Adelaide, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good.
How are you feeling today? Are you excited to be here?
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. I have so much to talk about with mental health. Always have so much to talk about with mental health.
Okay, great. That's great. Well, I'm not going to stop you. Just introduce yourself. Tell the listeners all about you.
I'm Adelaide. I recently became a senior in high school, so year 13 if you speak in British terms. I do a lot of mental health advocacy, and I really started doing that when I was in year 10. So that's freshman of high school. When my school did this boarding year program, and we all went abroad for a year, and that's when I really became aware of just the realm of mental health, like mental illnesses, from personal experiences, and also just watching my friends and people I care about going through some struggles. And so that's when I started, learning more about ways to help and self-care, which I think is so important. We'll talk about that later. And so I started my mental health journey by joining a group called Hong Kong Joint School Society of Psychology, which is founded by my friend and I, Kristen. And for that, we mainly focused on local school students and just volunteering for the local Hong Kong community. When I heard that my friends in the year above, Niasa and Haining, were starting a mental health advocacy group in our school, I obviously wanted to join. And I think the first year we joined, it was great. We made our presence known in the school, and we really raised more conversations about mental health and just taking care of our bodies and our minds, aside from just focusing on academics, which I think is a big focal point in Hong Kong youth mindsets. And so after the first year, my friends entrusted me to lead Peace of Mind. And during my time leading it, we did a lot of outreach with local communities such as Mind Hong Kong, Cool Minds, and we invited guest speakers. One of them was Erin, who also leads a mental health organization in Hong Kong. It's called Talking Mental. Very lovely people. Also very passionate about mental health. And Steph, who is from Body Banter, she's actually an alumni of my school. And she always visits us and gives us like talks about body positivity, which I think is also something we can touch on later. And yeah, so I think a lot of what we do in Peace of Mind and what I do in general as a mental health advocate is just trying to like spark more conversations, make sure more people are comfortable with speaking about mental health around myself, and also just comfortable with their own mental health situations, because I think it's time for us to normalize mental health conversations.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you on that. And I feel like there is a lot of conversation now, and it's just starting to spark because of our generation and our kind of curiosity with things like this. And you mentioned reaching out to a bunch of different organizations and different programs and individuals. How was it like what was the reaction like from your community and from your school when you started the organization and then started branching out and meeting other organizations and individuals who are passionate about mental health?
So I think as far as international schools go, my school is quite keen on students being proactive about things that they're passionate about and just engaging in any way possible. And so when I'm inviting guest speakers, our school always welcomes them. They do their background checks, obviously, but it's always very positive response, very positive welcoming. And I think it's just because I think mental health is a big topic, especially for youths. So then when it becomes when we make it known that this is something that we're very passionate about and we want to take more strides in it, then the people in different generations will also see that this is an influential topic. And I think it just also goes to show the importance of youth advocacy work anyway. So I think this also goes to show how important youth advocacy work is in general. When I see some of my friends who are in international organizations, and we chat about our different causes. So the general feedback I always hear is that there's no harm in trying, and I think that the more people that you hear from about certain topics such as mental health or different social issues, the more you hear people talk about issues such as mental health or just other social issues, the more it becomes ingrained in your mind, and that's what makes the topic more comfortable for us to talk about. And yeah.
Absolutely. And it's amazing to see how far we've come as a generation, and especially being in Hong Kong. I'm sure you've had your own experience with mental health and with having different comments and different perspectives surrounding it, how people would interact with you. Do you have any kind of personal anecdotes that you experienced in terms of mental health and in terms of the stigma around it as an Asian student?
So I think it's really ingrained within just Asian culture in general to expect a lot from yourself. And so I think one thing that I've definitely struggled with is just self-worth and kind of this idea of negative self-talk that I'm sure is something that a lot of people can relate to. I've grown up with doing a lot of activities such as singing, just performing in general. I loved reading as a child. I still love reading. Academic focus was always important in my family and in my household. And also my dad is very keen on sports. So I guess it's kind of very an all-rounded upbringing. And so I think one thing that I've struggled with is just the idea of balancing everything and kind of having to reassure myself at times that it's okay to not be excellent in everything, because that's just not possible. And that's one of the biggest struggle that I've endured in regards to kind of self-expectations, especially when as you grow older, academics itself becomes more kind of arduous with high school, IB curriculum, even in music and performances, everybody, because there's so many years of experience and everybody kind of has their own edge to it. It's harder to stand out. And so I think for me, it's always been just trying to navigate my own path and like finding what makes me stand out as an individual. With regards to the idea of like self-talk, one thing I try to like remind myself as reassurance is just that like the accumulation of your mistakes or like failures is essentially what leads to like personal growth and introspection. And that's something like I think is super important for just maturing. So I think the whole idea with maturing and like just reflecting on your past mistakes is just kind of key to like being able to, you know, do better in the future. And so like, I don't know, one thing I've always said to myself, like I've always like thought is that like, I guess like you're your toughest critic. I don't know, that's very generic, but I think that's one thing that I've heard a lot of people say to me, and that's something that I just keep in mind, because at the end of the day, like I saw this one clip on YouTube actually, and it was of this one painter doing an experiment where he invited a bunch of other like artists and different and they would all kind of come in a circle and draw their own like perceptions of themselves, and then they would do rotations where the other artists would draw themselves, and you could definitely see which ones were the like self-perceived art, because it was just one that was filled with like blemishes and insecurities. And like in the arts that like in the artworks that other people displayed, like you couldn't see any of that, because it's like when you're looking at somebody else, you always see the positive in it. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind when we're, you know, treating ourselves at that, like, you know, just try to, one thing I think it's important though, like one thing I tell myself is to treat like yourself like how you would treat your best friend, you know, like sometimes you got to be hard on yourself and make sure that you get through those obstacles in a productive way. But also there are times where you just need to kind of let loose and don't be resentful of just small, like minor mistakes, because it's these like kind of low moments that will make up our individuality.
Absolutely. And that's a beautiful anecdote that I feel like a lot of students, like, especially I've seen the pressure that a lot of students in Hong Kong take on, and like we have to kind of learn how to treat ourselves like we want to treat others. And I think like you kind of briefly touched on the kind of mentality of Hong Kongers, and in terms of like having a bit of a conservative mindset, like how have you seen that like play out since like you were a kid and growing up now? Like how has that changed?
I think with the conservative mindset, like as a child, I grew up in a local school. I'm not sure. Well, for the viewers who are unaware, a local school is basically like schools that just strictly follow the Hong Kong style, whereas international schools they kind of follow, well, as self-explanatory as it is, they kind of follow the more like global, like Americanized or like British way of education. And so when I was in a local school, I think a lot of the emphasis was genuinely on like academic focus, and that would be how you would kind of build your confidence and build again your self-worth. And so whenever you kind of mess up on a test, and again, this is not to say like all local schools are like this, it was just like my experience in particular, especially again with like tough self-expectations. But so whenever I would kind of get a lower grade on a test, then I'd just be like, uh-oh, red warning sign in my brain, like something is happening, you need to get better. And so since I've left that kind of very like stressful environment and adapted to this kind of new, I think more refreshing way of thinking, I think I've learned to be able to just recover, like focus on the recovery process of like when you kind of drop, focusing on the recovery rather than just kind of beating yourself up at the lowest point. Because when you do that, you don't really get anywhere and you just end up feeling worse about yourself. And like when you're already not at your best, just stepping on yourself won't make anything better. You want to work on like how to get back to that stage and finding a new source of motivation, finding some kind of positivity to finding a source of positivity to focus on, so that you can get back to like where your best performing state is. And so that's what I've learned to focus on, and I think that's been very prominent in enabling my kind of character growth.
Absolutely. And it also like kind of shifts on to the point where we talk about how we as people like discuss stigma. Like if personally we've gone through, like you were saying, like if we've gone through certain things, like we are automatically like harsh on ourselves. Like when you're talking about the example of your test, like we feel like we're harsher on ourselves. But if we kind of leave that sort of environment and grow and learn to like adapt into a different one where people are more open about things like this topic, like it really does like change how we talk about mental health. And do you feel like you could kind of hear the difference in your internal dialogue as well as your external dialogue with other individuals?
Yeah, I think definitely. Like, I think especially since the pandemic, one thing that I've tried to focus on is just the idea of like finding a source of like solace, if that makes sense. Especially when like I've got like when I've hit a low point, and then I'll try to focus on like whatever is comforting to me at the moment, and that really ranges. Like I've gone through my own journey with like self-care, and you know, the stereotypical like journaling and exercising. Like I've definitely done all of those, and I love all of them. Like I had a whole running phase where I would literally go running every time I did bad in a singing performance, or like did bad on a written test, or just, you know, reading. I love reading, again, as I mentioned. I think it's just about like exploring different ways to kind of calm yourself down. And also, like, since I'm on the topic of solace, like, I think it's just important to remind yourself that like whatever works for other people might not work for you. Like I've heard many of my friends like talking about like how cooking or like baking is a really healthy kind of pick me up for them. And for me, it just becomes like a stressor because I'm such a perfectionist that like every time when the temperature is not right, I will just have to start over. And I think it's like it's really like trial and error, as with everything else in life. And so it's not like when you're trying to find that like comforting thing, I think what I've learned to do, whether that be like my trial and errors with baking or, you know, even with like just practicing piano, it's just learning to kind of surrender yourself to that activity and not focusing on like whatever control you want to hold over like your ability to perform. Because like for that specific activity, like it's not about how well you do, it's about how good it makes you feel, you know. And just focusing on like your satisfaction rather than your capability, I think, is what makes you feel better.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, that like we see certain things on like, especially like how our generation is so tied to social media. Like we see so many things on social media, and like we talk to other people and we think that like everything that happens to them might like work for us. Like, you know, like for example, the whole era of like the hot girl walk, for example, like some people love being outside and nature fulfills them, and some people just don't like it at all, and it doesn't do anything to like heal them or make them feel better. And when we talk about this with other people, like we maybe sometimes feel like certain things may not work for us at all. But I think like when you talk a bit more about like taking care of yourself and also like the importance of like self-talk, like it really plays a heavy factor into that. And like I'm kind of curious, like how do you see like the spectrum of mental health in that like scenario, like when you're talking about what works for you in terms of like doing physical activities, but also like learning how to make better decisions like for yourself, as you were talking about when you were kind of changing your mindset when you had changed schools, and also just kind of changing the way you approach mental health?
So I think that like, yes, obviously mental health is a spectrum, and like how I visualize the whole idea of like the mental health spectrum is just that you have that stage where you're like stable and healthy, and then sometimes you slip into periods of instability where you have like highs and lows, and then it kind of becomes a bit more serious, and that eventually might lead to like illnesses. And I think with like what we just talked about with self-care, I think that's what's kind of maintaining, like that's what kind of maintains the that's what kind of bridges between the instability and the stability, if that makes sense. And you want to just keep on practicing and reassuring yourself and, like giving yourself words of like positive affirmation, if you believe in affirmations, so that you can like maintain that stability even when you are going through hard times. And so, but also at the same time, like even when you are actually like going through more serious like struggles or illnesses, I think there is still that idea of self-care that is maintained, but it might appear in different ways. For example, like I think we had a chat previously where we just talked about like the idea of self-care during like an illness, where it's really it's like the focus is just on prioritizing yourself and doing what is best for you. And sometimes, that might hurt somebody else's feeling, but at the end of the day, you just need to like focus on your own health and well-being first. And then when you're better, you can make up for it. Because I think something that I've grown to understand both from my own experiences and from other people's experience is that like people shouldn't judge you for how you behave when you are at like a low point of your mental health. Because when I'm not at my best mental state, like that definitely displays itself in my relationship with other people. So I think it's important to remember, like when you're going through things, that like hopefully, and I'm sure the people around you can sense that and will also kind of take that, keep that in mind when conflicts happen. And yeah, so I think self-care is just, it takes different forms within the different points of the mental health spectrum, but it's also just something that you always have to constantly like practice, and obviously to different extents, as you are going through your mental health journey.
And I love the point that you made about compassion, because it's like we always think that certain decisions that we make are like incredibly like difficult for some other people. Like, what will they think if I say this, or what will they think if I do this, or how will they react if I do this? But at the end of the day, you're making the decision for you, not for other people. And like there is a really key element when we talk about like how we talk to other people about certain things. Like we can't always make other people happy, but we have to try our best to first put ourselves first and then work on the kind of outer people of our circle. And that really ties back into what we were talking about in terms of the conservative mindset of not just Hong Kongers, but a lot of Asian communities as well, because they're more like group focused and collective focused, whereas like we shift to like a different mindset where it's like individualistic and we're focusing on putting ourselves first rather than an entire community or entire generation first instead. So I think that's a really important point that I think a lot of students need to recognize, and not just for students, but also just for adults and people who are struggling with making key decisions. And I also like, this kind of leads into a question that I have about kind of making like good self-care choices. Like, do you think that we as people like can make self-care choices that aren't necessarily like physically tied to us? Like, for example, like how do you think that decision making like kind of ties into a form of self-care?
Well, I have a very kind of shallow example of that, but I think just the idea of like making plans with friends and then kind of ditching because you don't feel well, like that's a very simple. That was just the first example that I could think of. But I think like again, like to different extents of self-care and depending on your own situation, like I think that whole process of like decision making in regards to self-care is just to like again prioritize yourself. And like while it's important to practice kindness and be considerate of other people's schedules and whatnot, at the end of the day, like you have to be kind to your own health as well. And I think while you're thinking of like, oh, how would my friend feel about this, like instead of thinking of that, think of like, if I stayed at home, like, what would I get out of this? Like, would I feel much better? If the answer is yes, then you should probably do that, because, you know, you want to focus on what gets you out of that, like, low moment. You know what I mean? And I think with decision making, I think that's also something I've struggled with, because, like, I'm totally an empath, and, like, also, like, just the way I've been brought up, because I'm in, like, I think it's a relatively big family, in my opinion. Like, there's always other factors to consider, and I think it's just also to go with learning and growing up and, like, introspection. Like, if you don't do it for yourself at the moment, like people aren't going to be able to trust you and like being able to participate in a relationship of any kind, whether that be a friendship or, like, romance, you know? If you aren't able to, like, trust yourself and trust your own decisions, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, like, we previously touched on this, but we didn't really fully explore it before, but how do you think, like, this kind of idea of, like, decision making and trusting yourself and, like, being able to grow from these mistakes, like, has, for you personally, like, changed during the pandemic, and also just in the context of peace of mind?
So I think I've definitely had my fair share of, like, having to make decisions. So during the first period of the pandemic, it was actually during our boarding year program, and I came back to Hong Kong. And at that time, I was just very, very much, like, new to the whole idea of mental health. And that's when I actually made the decision to join Peace of Mind, because I decided at that point that, like, I wanted to be active and kind of learn more by directly engaging in this community. But then that first quarantine period, I was really just focusing on, like, absorbing more information about, like, ways to take care of my own mental health, and also just to help other people in general. And that was kind of my way of self-caring, if that makes sense. So when the second or third wave hit, I think I became more affected by that, because I was already getting back used to the idea of, like, normalcy. And so during the most recent COVID period, I actually left Hong Kong to reunite with a lot of my family and friends in London. I think that was the best decision I made for myself. And I think it was the best decision I could have made at that time for, like, the sake of my mental health. Because, and I obviously recognize, like, my privileges in being able to make that decision and to go through with it. Because I think the reality is it's very hard for people nowadays to travel, especially in Hong Kong, where I'm based in. But back to what I was saying. I think that choice made, like, just being in a new environment and kind of reuniting with people I cared and loved about, just allowed me to kind of regain some positive motivation in my life. And then I kind of also delved more into my passion projects during the summer. And I think that's just, like, prepared me better for this final year of high school, where I'm entering it with a more positive and just in general, like, a more refreshed mindset, just ready to take on and embark on this new set of challenges brought up by the Ivy.
Absolutely. And Adelaide, like, I am truly, like, in awe of, like, everything you've gone through and how you've been able to deal with that. And, like, I was just picking out this when you said this, but I love that your form of self-care was to be able to help other people get their own form of self-care, like, through peace of mind. I feel like that's an amazing thing, and it is really difficult, especially in this day and age, for people to kind of also consider other people while they're struggling with their own mental health journey. So I really want to thank you for sharing that. And before we end the podcast and we have to end this beautiful conversation, I want to ask if there is an anecdote or piece of advice that you'd want to share for other students, youth, or even adults that are struggling with mental health issues and with stigma or general, like, motivation and possibly people who want to be a part of an organization or start an organization like Peace of Mind?
I think one word of advice that I have is just really, again, trying to find that source of solace, that source of comfort for you, and don't be afraid to like try different things. Like sometimes they just don't click, like again, me with baking, they don't click, but it's okay because I kind of navigated different activities and then I was able to find, like, rediscover my passion with music, for example. And so I think just don't be afraid to try different things to get to know yourself more, and I think just don't be afraid to let other people know that you're taking time to take care of yourself. It's definitely I think it's definitely something that like our generation, our culture is still evolving into this idea of like prioritizing the self. And so I think just, be the change, just don't be afraid to work on yourself and just sparing the time to focus on yourself and your body and your mind. And with active engagement with mental health advocacy, a piece of advice I would have is just reach out to as many people as possible, because this community of mental health advocates are like, there's no limit to it, we always want more advocates. So yeah, just try to be engaged, reach out to more people, and you maybe will appear on this podcast.
Absolutely. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much again, Adelaide. Everyone, please go and check out Peace of Mind on Instagram. They have amazing posts, amazing advice, and just really great external resources to help with mental health stigma in Hong Kong for youth and for adults. And with that, I just want to say thank you again, Adelaide, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I loved listening to Juhi and Adelaide. And what really struck a chord with me is when Adelaide shared about how we need to focus on our own mental health and well-being first. And we all know that, don't we? In theory, we know that. Put our oxygen mask on first. But our busy lives with many responsibilities and also passions, I think, make it really hard at times to prioritize self-care. So today I just want to leave you with that. Please do take care of yourself and reach out for help when you feel overwhelmed. You don't have to figure everything out on your own. Yeah, it is really important to remember that. Thank you so much for listening today, and I talk to you very soon. Bye.